Wonderful to see you all. In some ways, it's a bit of a strange transition because when I planned my words for tonight, I hadn't considered that we would be going from a baby naming to this opening line, but here it goes. I remember the first time I realized my Grampa Joe was going to die. It just turns out that this week is his yahrzeit, so I wanted to talk about him. But in some ways, it's a beautiful life lesson because we have the coming together of those moments, baby namings and celebrations and weddings and all of the smachot, the joyous moments in our lives. But there are also moments when we gather for loss. Now, when I realized that my grandpa was going to die, it wasn't because he was sick. He wasn't in the hospital. He wasn't in a nursing home or anything like that. He was actually about as vigorous as you could imagine a 70-year-old could be. Because when I realized this, I was on the back of his motorcycle. We were driving from work. In the summers, I worked for my grandfather in his store. He sold vitamins and health food. And we were making a delivery. He had trusted, beloved customers that he'd had for decades, and he would personally deliver vitamins to them. And so we were making our delivery, and I was sitting on the back of the motorcycle, a skinny 11-year-old kid. We didn't wear helmets back then, parents. It was a little bit scary. But I was sitting on the back of the motorcycle. I was dressed in my work clothes because I've been working for him all day. You know what, Margaret? I'm going to switch to this mic. Let's see if it's a little less windy. Is that a little better? I think that might be a little bit better. So I was sitting on the back of his Honda 450 motorcycle, which is a pretty big bike, but he never took it out of third gear. He never got over about 25 miles an hour. It didn't matter where we were going. And we're driving home, and it was a typical July day in Omaha. If you've never been there, then just imagine just being in a shower all day long. A very, very warm shower. That's kind of how it felt. And so there was sweat, dripping down my nose onto my grandpa's shirt, and I was holding on to the sides of the motorcycle for dear life. And we were driving down the road to make this delivery, and we drove by this small store, and I noticed that there were tombstones inside the store. And my grandpa said to me in sort of a low voice, he said, "Sonny, my footstone is in there. It's all carved up." And because my grandpa was a child of the Depression, he was quick to add, "and it's paid for." He wanted me to know that. He said, "It's all carved up and it's paid for. I bought it when your grandmother died. It's cut from the same stone we used for her. And all they need to do when I die is carve in the day of my death." And I remember thinking, that's kind of a heavy thing to drop on an 11-year-old grandpa. We were just at work having a great time. But then I also remember thinking, that can't be. You won't ever die. You'll be with me forever. Who else will give me motorcycle rides? And actually, Grampa Joe used to take me horseback riding too. And he used to take me ice skating. And every Sunday night, he would cook us steaks on his grill, even when it was cold and snowy out. No, Grandpa, I thought to myself, you'll never die. But of course, on another level, as an 11-year-old child, I knew that someday he would. And this Sunday will be the 20th day of the Hebrew month of Tammuz, and it'll mark the 31st yahrzeit for my Grampa Joe. But he taught me a really important lesson that day, and it's similar to a lesson that we learn in this week's Torah portion, a lesson that Moses teaches all of us. Moses, like my Grampa Joe, knew that he was going to die. In this week's Parashat Pinchas, God instructs Moses to climb up on a mountain so he can see the land that God has given to the Israelite people. Remember, Moses himself doesn't get to go into the land, but Moses is allowed to look into the land that his children, as it were, will go into. And God says, when you've seen the land, then you will be gathered to your kin, just as your brother Aaron was. And so Moses, even though he was still a vigorous leader, he learns from God that his time is coming to an end. And what is Moses' response? Now, it's interesting. The Midrash imagines Moses arguing with God and saying, no, I won't do it. I'm not going to die. But that's not what actually happens in the Torah. In the Torah itself, Moses' concern is not for himself. and wanting to live longer. It's for his people. What Moses says is, let the eternal source of the breath of all flesh appoint someone over the community who shall go out before them and come in before them, and who shall take them out and bring them in, so that God's community, and this is the important part that Moses says, so that God's community may not be like sheep that have no shepherd. And the great biblical commentator Rashi writes that this passage teaches us how praiseworthy the righteous are. When the righteous are about to die, Rashi says, they put their affairs in order and busy themselves with the needs of the community. They put their affairs in order and busy themselves with the needs of the community. A lesser man than Moses would likely be consumed with bitterness at not being allowed to enter the promised land. It doesn't seem fair. He's worked so hard. He's been through so much. Can he at least enter the land? And maybe it would be hard, therefore, to think about the needs of others instead of his own feelings of hurt. But this is one of the lessons that Moses teaches us. We must put our duties and responsibilities to those who put their trust in us first, those who rely on us, our families and our clients and our friends. Our affairs must be in order so that we can attend to these obligations. And of course, it's not just about the material matters, making sure that you have an estate plan in place, that you've made arrangements to take care of your favorite tzedakot, including our temple in your plans, and making sure that there are things like my grandpa shared with me that day, like footstones in order, but also putting your emotional affairs in order. Are there petty resentments and familial rivalries that we've been carrying with us for years and years that we need to take care of? Do we have unfinished business of the heart? Are there apologies that we know we need to make that we haven't yet made? And is there forgiveness that we can grant others that we haven't yet done? There's a famous teaching in the Talmud that's taught in the name of Rabbi Eliezer, and we often bring it out around the High Holy Days. Rabbi Eliezer teaches, Shuv yom echad lifnei mitatecha. He says, repent one day before you die. But then if his students come to him and they say, Rabbi, how are you going to know when it's one day before you're going to die? No one can know that. And he said, aha, that's why you should repent every day. Every day, because you don't know. You don't know when the end might come, God forbid. You just don't know. And so it means that every day you should make sure that you have your spiritual matters in order, your emotional matters in order. All of that business has to be taken care of. And so this week's parashah invites us through Moses' example to do just that. I remember very well the last time I saw my Grampa Joe alive. I was on my way to the airport, flying to Israel to begin rabbinical school. And my mom and I stopped at Grampa Joe's house on the way to the airport early in the morning so that I could say goodbye to him. We were very close. As I told you earlier, I worked for him every summer, and I spent so much time with him. And the year after I graduated from college, I came back home to work at the synagogue, and that year was a real gift because I got to spend a lot of time with my grandpa and with my mom as well, who passed a few years after that. And so I was going to say goodbye to him, and I gave him a big hug, and I told him I'd write him, and I'd call every now and then. Kids back then, to make a phone call from Israel cost money. Now it's just a WhatsApp call. It's free. And so he said to me, he said, goodbye, Sonny. And then he said something to me that day that I don't recall him ever saying before. He said, God bless you. And we got in the car, and my mom burst into tears. And she was just sobbing. And I said, Mom, what is it? And she said, Grandpa's worried that he's never going to see you again. And he just gave you his final blessing. And it was his last words to me. He died 5 weeks later. There is, sadly, a frightening urgency to this teaching. God willing, we'll all be granted, each of us, years of good health. And we'll have plenty of time to put our affairs, material, emotional, and spiritual, in order. But who knows? There's the lesson of Rabbi Eliezer. One day before that final day comes, we need to have our affairs in order. So our tradition suggests that we should continually be involved in the work of teshuvah, of introspection, of self-improvement, of planning for the future. And so my prayer on this Shabbat, my grandpa's 31st yahrzeit, and Parashat Pinchas, is that we be given the strength and the wisdom and the courage to understand that living our lives fully means also planning carefully and responsibly and appropriately for the inevitable. Like Moses, like my Grampa Joe, like every creature that has ever lived, the time will come when our affairs really need to be in order for the sake of those we will leave behind. Shabbat Shalom.